Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second Frank Rhodes Lecture of the year. We are very delighted to have a speaker who is going to walk us through the journey from not knowing to knowing. So what an exciting topic for us to be spending our time on this afternoon. At ASU, as we move to evolve our enterprise model, we need to continue to find ways to challenge ourselves and challenge our thinking. Challenge ourselves about what the role of an institution is with our kind of a charter, challenge our assumptions about what we must do and how to do it, challenge our sense of possibilities. And the Frank Rhodes Lecture was set up to bring visionary leaders and thinkers to ASU to help us do just that. Challenge our thinking, help us see the world, see possibilities, and see opportunities a little differently. And so we have with us Sarah Stein Greenberg from the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, popularly known as the D.school at Stanford. And I will turn it over to President Crow here in just a second to introduce Sarah. But I wanted to share a few housekeeping items before we get going here. The chat will be open for brief periods of time during the session. We're going to encourage you to interact as much as you can, but please don't use the chat for your questions. Drop all of your questions for Sarah in the Q&A, and we will bring that up in the discussion periods and make sure we grab all of your questions. So engage with the chat based on what Sarah is going to ask you to do, but drop all of your questions into the Q&A. The recording of the session will be available on the Frank Rhodes Lecture Series website. So you're welcome to view it again, share it with those who were unable to be here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to President Crow to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Manu. It's great to see everybody here, and glad we can still get together here in the middle of the pandemic. It's great to have Sarah here with us today because she epitomizes in almost every way what we're trying to do. She's what I call a designer, a design enabler. She's able to empower design across organizations, across subcultures, across cultures. I mean, it's a very complicated thing. And one of the great things about Stanford design is that it's a lot more than about designing buildings or designing towns or designing communities. It's about putting together the constructs, social, physical, cultural, all of those things together that then allow us to achieve things that we haven't been able to achieve. And so the thing about design is that design is the method by which we attain the things that we want to attain that we haven't been able to attain. And it's really the case if you think about the phrase that we have as the underpinning here: challenge, disrupt, and redesign. If you look at American higher education, it's been a great, unbelievable thing in the evolution of our democracy, but it's not good enough in its present design configuration. It needs to be challenged. It needs to be disrupted. It needs to be redesigned. And upon the redesign, it needs to be moving forward in new ways. Frank Rhodes inspired us to do that. And we decided more than 10 years ago that we would bring in people of great creative energy and great logical creativity to be able to drive forward our design process. And Sarah Stein Greenberg really provides that for us. I can't really explain to you the breadth across which she thinks, but she's a little bit Da Vinci-like in the sense that there's art, there's photography, there's a focus on the environment, a focus on nature, there's a focus on all these things coming together. And what that means then is that Sarah, from my read and from my one and a half interactions with her, she is a person who understands all the forces that are at work when you're trying to design a particular outcome that you're moving towards. So it's been great that we've been able to get Sarah to join us and to move things forward. I'm looking forward to the not knowing to knowing. We've been doing some pedagogical redesign at the university where we believe that you can teach things better from what you don't know than from what you do know, and get tremendously enhanced outcomes from that. And so that's sort of a design parameter that one could think about in the conceptualization of a university. So Sarah, it's great to have you here. Really excited about what you have to say. And I'm going to drop off to the audience side and Thanks for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that amazing introduction, both of you. And I just want to say I'm so honored to be here. I have such huge respect for the work that all of you at ASU are doing, and the clarity of your vision and the ambition and the ways in which you are already innovating and really disrupting what higher education can look like is an inspiration. And I mean that in a very, very sincere way. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. And I understand that it's actually after the end of your formal semester. So an extra thank you to those of you who are joining today, kind of like beyond the call of duty. And I hope we're gonna have a great conversation together and talk about some provocative ideas. Now, because I have so much confidence and faith in this audience, I actually am going to start by asking for your help and participation. So this huge topic that we are all interested in together, this idea of what is the future of higher education, how can we get closer and closer to it, is a really big one. And so to start off, I'm gonna ask you to actually go with me on a little journey. So I want you to start looking around the physical space that you're in. That could be your desk or the room that you're in, and I want you to actually grab an object, a physical object that to you represents the future of higher education. Now, it could represent like a little piece of the future. It could represent the entirety of your vision, some kind of metaphor. So like, I really mean it. I can't see you, but I know that in this group, you're right now getting up and moving around and grabbing your object. So maybe your object is something like an external hard drive. Your idea for the future of higher ed is that, you know, in the future, we're going to have all information that we need right at our fingertips. Or maybe it's something like the adapter that you use. And the idea here is that, you know, it's fundamental to the future of higher ed to connect the student with really meaningful employment opportunities. And that's what the future of higher ed has to look like. So whatever it is, grab your object and start to come back to your desk or to your computer. And as soon as you've got this thing that is going to represent this slice of your vision, I want you to go ahead and throw that into the chat. So please share, what is your object and why does it represent the future of higher ed? And as soon as we have a few in there, and don't worry about, you know, wordsmithing, maybe it's going to be super short. We've got a TV remote control. Jason, can you tell us why it is that TV remote control represents the future of higher ed? Scott says iPhone because students need to have access to information. Education needs to do more to give them information. We've got some clear tape. I want to hear more about that. Computer provides access to everywhere, right? That is a powerful vision, a powerful metaphor. A pocket mirror, I see a reminder that the future, it went by so fast. The future the agency of learning is with us. Wow, that is very powerful. A Post-it note to record the ideas we didn't know we were going to have and to add them to the conversation. Wow, that is like so evocative of all those, you know, late night conversations that you have with your teammates and other students when you're working together. Oh, I love this one, a coffee mug. Coffee represents connection, conversation, community, comfort, contemplation, but can also be customized to suit everyone's taste. That is really powerful. I love this one, an eraser, because we need to be willing to work and rework. So these are just incredible. And we're gonna leave this up so you can keep going through them at your own pace. But I'll say just a few things that I notice about this set. I mean, one thing is these are incredibly imaginative. And I think that this reflects kind of like the type of imagination that we actually need to see a future that might look very different and should in many ways look very different than the past and even the present. Also, like, these are all different from each other. And I think that's a nice reminder that we actually need people who think very differently to be working on this incredibly audacious challenge. And I also think, you know, there might have been a few of you who started looking around and like drew a blank, right? This is a hard challenge. And if you had a moment of struggle, like I feel you, this struggle is real. This is a really challenging type of work to commit yourself to. So it's great to see all of these different examples. So my provocation to you is that, you know, the way that innovation often works is that like ideas start to grow together and to converge. And so if you're looking through here and you see someone whose idea is really resonating with you, like you might find a moment to reach out to them and have a virtual cup of coffee or tea and grab a chance to kind of like nurture that little seed of an idea, and maybe your ideas will grow together in a new and interesting way. I'll share my example of like an artifact that represents the future of higher education at the moment. So this is my copy has a different cover, but there's a short story in this incredible collection by a science fiction writer named Vandana Singh. And she writes this story called Ambiguity, Machines, and Examination. And the story is rooted in the idea that in the future, there is a type of engineering discipline in which the final examination that you're given involves going through the accounts of different ambiguity machines, which are machines that have been created that ought not to exist. They seem to defy the laws of physics, the way that we understand time and space to work now, and yet they do exist. So this story is just rife with ambiguity at every level, and it's so beautifully written. It's even ambiguous who the test taker might be. And I love this as an example. I think there's like this little kernel of something very powerful when I think about my vision for the future of higher education, which has to do with this principle around ambiguity and how important it is. And, you know, the idea that there could be a whole field in the future which centers its final examination before someone is ready to graduate around this concept of being ready to navigate things that are ambiguous, spaces that are ambiguous, ideas that are ambiguous. That really resonates with me for reasons that will become extremely clear in just a moment or two. So let's dive in a little further, and I wanna start by giving just one way to think about design. This is one of the ways that we talk about design with our students at the D.school, and we really talk about it as in its most abstracted form as a relationship between problem finding and problem solving. Now, I think in a lot of ways, most of us are trained to be really good at problem solving, and we focus less on problem finding. At least that's what we often experience with students who are new to the D.school. And the problem finding part of design is equally, if not more important in some ways. And problem finding involves all kinds of forms of research. It involves, you know, interviewing, ethnography, observation. It involves understanding the systems that you're trying to change, some of the historical forces. And we often talk about that as need finding, right? We're part of the movement around human-centered design. And so making sure that there are some real human needs at the center of the way in which we're conceptualizing the problem that we're then going to go and solve. That's a very important part of our way of working. And what happens when we really give students permission, not just permission, in fact, it's really a requirement and expectation that they participate not just in problem solving, but also in problem finding, is that the way in which they engage with our coursework is that they wind up having to navigate much more ambiguity than they may have been expecting. And for a lot of students, that is actually quite disorienting at the beginning. That can be you know, a very different way of learning. And so as a result, we have started to really elevate and explore all of the ways in which ambiguity is not necessarily something that people are particularly comfortable with right off the bat, and kind of deserves its own spotlight in terms of thinking about the abilities that are required for doing really good design work. And I would argue are required even beyond the field of design. any kind of creative work really involves navigating ambiguity. And I would say even, being a citizen of the world today involves being able to navigate ambiguity as things change in ways that feel like it's actually an accelerating pace of change. So we sometimes talk about design work using this metaphor of a journey. And I like to think about it as a journey from not knowing to knowing. That involves some really specific skills around design. And the end point of a journey from not knowing to knowing, of course, is never that you're perfectly expert or absolutely everything about the thing you're trying to design or the experience or the system that you're trying to change, but just that you start from a stance where you are really open about the fact that you don't know what the right answers are. In fact, there's probably not one right answer, certainly not in kind of an open-ended, messy, ambiguous kind of problem space like we like to work in design. And the point isn't the knowing, right? It's falling in love with the journey itself and the ways in which when you start to feel like you have control over your own skills and your own dispositions as it relates to being in these messy, challenging problem spaces, that you start to develop a sensitivity for when you're right nearby a breakthrough. So that the experience that you have in design is one where you begin to build this competency, and you know that the problems worth working on really have some degree of ambiguity and start you off in that place of not knowing. And over time, as you gain confidence, that often becomes, what defines an exciting challenge to work on. And that's the progression that we hope to see in our students. So this ability to navigate ambiguity and go on this journey has really been a part of design for forever. It's really what design is about, even as the context and tools change. And some of those really specific tools that I think are useful to describe have to do with leveraging and embracing parallel possibilities, for example. So we often express this through the way that we work with what's called parallel prototyping, right? So at the beginning of a design process, as you're exploring the space, you reframe the problem often. And then once you start moving into solution mode, you're still carrying forward lots of possibility and doing that through building and making multiple versions of your core idea, or continuing to explore divergent ideas and getting real feedback on that is what allows you to not converge too quickly on one single narrow solution. In design, we also are constantly visualizing and building and iterating both what we're making and how we're working. And that is a really important piece about developing the ability to improvise, to iterate on your own process, on your own way of leaning into a particular problem. And then we also use constraints. Right? So constraints are fundamental to creativity in many ways. And yet, if you have too highly a constrained problem space from the beginning, you are really unlikely to get to any place that feels innovative. You're limiting the potential in too rigid a way. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you have a totally unconstrained problem that you're working on, you are often paralyzed with indecision. And so constraints and developing the judgment over time of how do you leverage constraints in just the right way to invite the right amount of ambiguity into your work is a skill in and of itself that we aspire to build with our students. So I want to make this a little bit more concrete by sharing one particular story about a student project from the D.school. And this will give you, I hope, a really good feel for the kind of design that we teach and that we're all about. So this is a story about a team of students that came together in 2014 in one of our classes, which is called Design for Extreme Affordability. And this was a group of interdisciplinary students, two who were in the med school, one who is a public policy student, and then the fourth one was a civil engineer. And they were partnered with a pretty amazing hospital chain in southern India that at the time was focused on cardiac care, with a really strong mission to deliver very high quality but very low cost healthcare at scale. And the students were asked to go and understand more about what was happening at the hospital and really immerse and find some opportunities to help the organization get closer and closer to their mission through design. It was very broad framing. So the students had a lot of agency to try to figure out what they were actually going to work on. And they did start with a bit of a hypothesis that because of the particular orientation of this hospital chain, that they were likely going to be designing something that would be for the clinicians or maybe for the hospital administrators, and that they would, it would be related to something around efficiency or maybe reducing the cost of some part of the process or the service model. So they went over with that sense of where they were likely to be headed in terms of their problem solving. And when they got there, they found a whole range of opportunities to design around. And one thing that really struck them was something that they hadn't expected. They saw and met a lot of people who were spending a long time waiting at the hospital. And they were waiting, far outside of the capacity of the formal waiting rooms. They were waiting in hallways. They were waiting kind of in the peripheral areas around the medical center. And the students got really curious about what was happening here. And so they started interviewing and asking more questions. And it turned out that many of the people who were waiting were close relatives. They were family members of people who were undergoing surgery or were in treatment in this hospital. And they learned that the family members would often be waiting not just hours, but sometimes days or even longer. And that their average time that they would have actually meeting with the doctor or the nurse would be very, very short. And that there was a tremendous amount of anxiety and uncertainty that the folks who were waiting were often feeling. And with that uncertainty came a lot of fear. And the students were really interested in trying to understand this more, despite the fact that it was outside of the original scope of what they thought that they were going to be working on. So they conducted their interviews, they learned a lot from patients and their families. And when they came back to campus after their research trip, they were really grappling with what they had seen and feeling like they had some kind of an obligation, some kind of a call to work on this challenge around the experience that family members were having in this particular hospital. So they started doing what I was describing before, which is parallel prototyping and experimenting rapidly. And this is an example of one of the sets of prototypes that they built and tests that they were running. And this particular prototype, they were starting to think about, how could we get those family members who are waiting more information? How could we help alleviate some of that suffering and anxiety by being thinking about them as potentially part of the group of people who are helping to provide care for the sick patient, not kind of on the outside of that process. So this is a prototype where they're trying to figure out, could we build some tools that would help someone learn how to take a pulse or take someone's blood pressure and kind of participate and be more active and have a real role in the care regimen. And importantly, they were trying to figure out, could they do this? Could they deliver effective education about this to a range of folks, regardless of their literacy level, regardless of whether they spoke the same language, which in the context that they were designing is a really important design consideration. So they got some great positive feedback from their partner for some of these early tests. And they had the opportunity to go back to India the following summer. And they started, this is an example of from their pilot of a nurse that they were partnering with who is teaching a group of patients, family members, how to take a pulse. And one of the students told me afterward that when they came back for the second day of this pilot, they found that there was a line out the door and around the block for this workshop. And she said, that was the moment that we knew this wasn't a student project anymore. This wasn't a class project. We had found a need that was really important. It was really big. And we were starting to get to that direction, starting to get to some of that knowing about the right direction to proceed in terms of a solution. So this is just an excellent example of where the way in which the students were empowered to do the primary research and then the tools that they had to reframe the problem as given has led to, I think, a much more powerful and effective intervention than the faculty could have crafted and then the original partner had initially conceptualized as being possible. So this group of students at the end of their degree programs decided to kind of defer everything else, and they founded an organization that is called Neura Health. And they've really oriented towards this idea around the kind of the way in which family members, who are really the people who care most for patients, are left out of patient healing, and their intervention at a very low cost sends patients home with somebody who has been trained to really take care of them. And the research that they've done from the medical perspective to validate this model shows a dramatic reduction in preventable readmissions and in post-surgical complications. And they are now scaling this model all over the region, both India and now Bangladesh. So this is a really remarkable story and an outcome and a good example of navigating ambiguity. I also want to say, and I don't normally talk about this when I'm sharing this particular story, but the moment that we're in right now, I think really calls for it. So the organization Neura Health has been, for the past several months, really reorienting towards working on immediate COVID relief, which, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, India is just in the grip of a really, really terrible health crisis around COVID-19. So I'm going to just share some information if you want to learn more about what the organization is doing, because they have this incredible network of frontline healthcare workers and the ability to reach directly to families in rural areas with very high quality healthcare information. So if you are moved to support that effort, I'll leave this here, and I'll put it back up at the end in case you don't get a chance to jot it down. So that brings me to the kind of the realities of the world that we're in today, which feel really dark at times. And I think that is, the reality that we're in. It's the reality that our students face. And it, I think, is fair to say that all of us who are working as hard as we can on, these ambitious and important ideas about what the shape of higher education might look like, we might be feeling some, I'll call it ambiguity fatigue at times, right? It is hard to grapple with so much uncertainty on a personal level, on a community level, professionally, and in our society at large. And I wanted to share one of the writers who I return to over and over when I am feeling that sense of fatigue around, I know ambiguity is great. I know how to bring it into my work and really leverage it because you can get to such fabulous outcomes, but it can be exhausting to have so much uncertainty present. And the writer that I often go back to is a historian and author named Rebecca Solnit, and she really explores this idea about what happens emotionally when you're facing uncertainty and when you're thinking about the future. And she says, that when we think about the future being dark, we often mean terrible instead of just meaning unknowable or inscrutable. And not knowing is actually kind of a neutral, it's not a value judgment, but we often feel that it is, right? We play, especially in an academic setting, we place a high premium on knowing, right? And on being certain. As if such a thing is possible when it comes to envisioning the future. And she talks about how, the human impulse to create certainty is so strong that it leads us to substitute the assumption that things will definitely get worse instead of just acknowledging that we can't predict what might happen. So she puts it this way. She says, we transform the future's unknowability into something certain, the fulfillment of all our dread, the place beyond which there is no way forward. And this is, I think, the way a lot of people might be feeling at the moment as we start to, in the US at least, you know, our public systems are starting to open up. Things are starting to return to something that feels a little bit more familiar, but at the same time, it also feels like everything has changed. And throughout her writing, Solnit really encourages us to react to these kinds of moments of uncomfortable uncertainty, not with kind of like a naive optimism or pessimism, but with a kind of informed hope, right? She says, you know, if you're just optimistic all the time, you're sort of assuming that everything will work out, which sort of means you don't have to do anything about it. And if you're just pessimistic, kind of assumes everything's going to get worse anyway. So again, you don't have to do anything about it. And she is all about action and engagement. And so this idea of informed hope is what I return to from time to time when I need a little bit of inspiration on this topic. And I think it's interesting to think about, you know, what does informed hope mean for the future of higher education, right? Informed hope might mean that students have the motivation to persist through a really difficult class. Or it might mean that, you know, we as educators and leaders can commit to the challenges that lie ahead of us. Or it might mean that we dare to invite more ambiguity into our work, even when we're feeling that sense of ambiguity fatigue. So I think it's important to recognize that reality around ambiguity and around what it means to kind of like stew in the discomfort of not knowing. And so because this is such a personal topic, and this is a group of people who are all working on, you know, highly ambiguous, challenging problems and opportunities around the future of higher ed, I wanted to spend some time exploring with all of us together, like, what are our own dispositions around designing with ambiguity? So what I want you to start thinking about is, you know, what is your own disposition towards ambiguity? And I want you to think about a project that you are working on right now. This could be, you know, something that President Crow has just asked you to take on. This could be something that you have been working on for a really long time that you really believe in, but is incredibly challenging and ambitious. Think about that and think about what you are feeling in terms of the ambiguity that's involved with that project. And as you're thinking about that, I'm just going to give you a few examples from our own students about, you know, ways in which they express relating to ambiguity. So these examples are from a project led by a couple of our faculty, Kelly Schmoody and Seamus Hart, who have been experimenting with different ways to use metaphors to have students express their relationship with ambiguity. So this particular student is saying ambiguity is like stumbling into a pit because the lows always precede the highs. And this student, for her, ambiguity is like walking in the dark. You have to trust yourself, your instincts, and the environment around you. This is a favorite of mine. Ambiguity is like falling in love. It's exciting, terrifying, but full of promise. And one more, ambiguity is like snapping a photo on a film camera, because it is only after it is carefully processed and dried that the true picture shows. And I love this one because it makes me think a lot about having a reflective practice and how important it is to look back at your work and debrief it and understand it and think about how you yourself are evolving your own practice, and how some of that you can only do when you're looking at the work that you've produced in retrospect. So the moment has come. I want to ask you to respond to the poll that Seth is going to put up in the Zoom window imminently. And you might feel, with the respect to the particular project that you have in your mind, that when it comes to ambiguity, you'll endure it. You like to plan ahead. Ambiguity is something that you have to conquer in order to move forward and get to that solution. Or you might choose option B. You'll engage it. You're interested in navigating ambiguity at times. You find it equally exhilarating and exhausting. Or third, you maybe are embracing it at the moment. Maybe you thrive the most in uncertain situations and you find ambiguity is a thrill, a challenge, an opportunity. So go ahead. Again, this is not something you need to overthink. And we'll take your responses just for the next 10 or 15 seconds. And as you're responding, I'll say, I don't think these are fixed character traits. I think this is very dependent on the situation that you're in. I think in some cases, people might love ambiguity in their personal life, but really want less uncertainty in their professional life, or vice versa. I think that the time that we're in and our recent experiences have an effect on this, on how you may be answering. So go ahead, you've got 5 seconds left if you haven't already committed to an answer. And then Seth, will you go ahead and share the results of the poll with all of us? Okay. Well, this is a really interesting profile. And actually, I will say, like, I will not go overboard in trying to interpret it, because I think, all of you who are part of the ASU community will have much more insight in terms of thinking about what this might mean. So really interesting. The dominant thread here is around engagement. And actually, that's where I would say I often find myself as well. And then, lots of folks who like to embrace it, and lots of folks who also feel like they have to endure it, right? This is I think a really healthy mix. And one thing that I'll say is that I think really highly functional design teams often have a mix like this. I think that when you have a group of people who are just all the way on one end of this and are all the embracers of ambiguity, you find there's often a challenge of knowing, like, when is the right time to stop exploring and start making some decisions. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you have a group who, nobody is really interested in embracing ambiguity, you may be foreshortening your design process. You may be cutting off opportunities and limiting your potential for innovation more than you have to. So I think this balance is really quite healthy. And what's become really apparent to us in working with these archetypes and ideas is that it's having the vocabulary to be able to talk about this in your team. That's where these tools become really valuable. So one of the patterns that we see just in terms of how people express themselves when they're coming up with these metaphors around ambiguity, you can see on the screen right now. So folks who are kind of in the endure archetype, their metaphors, not themselves, these are not, qualities of people, but their metaphors often express, feeling lost or disoriented, ambiguity, feeling like they have to overcome something or it's a challenge. And this sense of relief or anticipation for arriving at a single destination that will provide them greater clarity. And the metaphor characteristics we see for folks who are kind of in the engage setting, it's more around like choosing or creating one's own paths, feeling acceptance in the face of the unknown, and that parity between sensing fear and danger and also excitement at the same time, and that sort of moving back and forth between those feelings very fluidly. And then for folks who are more in the kind of embrace area, and I think the falling in love metaphor that we saw just a minute ago is a good example of this. It's like, those metaphors are about finding or interpreting something of great value, and actively working over time or undertaking work with a really undefined finished state. So I hope this language is provocative for you, and of value for you as you think about, what would it be like to have a conversation amongst a team that you're leading or within a class of students that you're supporting or teaching, to actually explore where folks are in terms of their relationship to ambiguity, and to start to develop that kind of common sense of knowledge and purpose about when is ambiguity really useful for us, and when do we need to add some constraints to make our work more straightforward or happen on a certain timeline. So my provocation is, that I think the importance of being able to navigate ambiguity is only growing. And I think as educators and particularly as designers of educational environments, we need to find more and more ways to embed this within our educational model. And, for us in terms of design, that means architecting the sequence that a student might go through so that they might start with a project that has relatively little ambiguity, and they start to feel some success early on, and they also develop this sensitivity to their own, kind of ingoing disposition around ambiguity. And then as they progress, they might be working on projects that are increasingly open-ended. And perhaps, by the end, they're framing and scoping their own challenges. And I think that ambiguity is as a skill, as an ability, can show up in many, many different disciplines, not just in design. And I would love to see what that looks like. I would love to see what a university context looks like, where navigating ambiguity is seen as one of the core skills that all graduates will acquire. Now, I want to just end before we turn to the more conversational part with one more thought that I wanted to share. Because as I said, when sometimes I'm feeling that, ambiguity fatigue, I look for examples or inspiration that help me get back to that place of informed hope about what the future can look like. So I want to share an artifact. This is something I ran across a few weeks ago that is a letter. It is an op-ed essay that was written by an undergraduate student, I think a philosophy student at Stanford. And he wrote a letter that is titled, "Is Being Pessimistic About the Future Unethical?" And the way that he wrote this letter, I found so captivating. He wrote it as a letter to himself from the 22nd century. And he did it in a way that is just, I think, beautifully done. So he positions, these letter writers from the future to him as being, these great coaches and mentors, and reassuring him that, our historical distance from you allows us to say that the future is bright, and your times were, pardon us, only slightly dimmer. And I'll say, the idea that you might get reassurance from the future that while we are in very challenging times at the moment, that better times are possible, that sets a frame for this student and for others, and I would include myself in that, of more informed hope. And he does a beautiful job of illustrating, this artifact from the future with, for example, attachment 2 is a photograph of a few joy towers that are now being built in any larger city. They're high, full of libraries and societies and agendas, very ornamental. Architects were patient to every detail. Although they are finite in height, in them one feels they grow to heaven. And I think that this is a beautiful example of a student who not only is thinking about navigating the ambiguity and the uncertainty of his future and his generation's future, he's like weaving with ambiguity. I mean, this is really next level. And I think that this kind of document pushes me to even think about what's beyond navigating ambiguity. And one of the things that I think is important for us to be doing even more of is, how do we support students to be able to have this kind of positive dream, right? How do we bring this out and help them chart what the future looks like, and know, as this one student so clearly does, that the frame that he leads with, the way in which he envisions his own future, has an enormous amount to do with how he will actually work and design it going forward. And I think that that's a lesson that, so many of our students can benefit from, and frankly, so can we. And that kind of informed hope is what I wish for all of us as we move into this next phase of our work in a world that has been, really irrevocably changed, and that we are here to continue to actively change. So thank you so much. And I hope that we get a chance to really dig in and get to some exciting questions.
Thank you. You are such a wonderful storyteller, and I was waiting for a few more stories of students, as you talked about the impact of a small group of individuals who were given an opportunity to really solve an important problem, but through the process of solving that problem, they acquired these incredible skills as navigators of ambiguity and as designers for the future. So very exciting to have heard from you. Questions are coming in to the Q&A channel. Please continue, for the audience, continue to add your questions. We'll take them as they come in. But there was a question that related to where you ended your talk on sort of the informed hope piece. And we have a question here from Kerry Lopez, who really resonated with that idea of hope as a way to advance ourselves and hope in the pathways that will help us get to the future we're all looking for. And her question is, as we think about transforming higher education, is part of our call to help students become or view themselves as designers? I'm sure you have a perspective on that, Sarah, if you'd like to elaborate.
I do. I mean, I kind of view, humans as designers. I think that's actually, one of the things that we're kind of oriented to. But I think that there is something special that happens when students start to embrace that idea for themselves. And I think designers can be found in any kind of field, in any kind of discipline, right? I actually don't think that design only has to be viewed as this sort of separate professional space. I think that the act of design is about intentionality. It's about really understanding the needs that are present in a situation. And then it's about having the understanding of like, how do you take action with all of that? Because design fundamentally is about making new things, experiences, products, services, environments. And so those blend of skills can be found in any discipline. And I think it's incredibly powerful for students to build their confidence as designers and take on that idea for themselves.
So, there's an interesting set of questions here about, where do you start? So we had one question from Tana Katerina Noor about, can we start from things that are working well? I mean, does the deficiency always, is that always necessarily the best place to start? And then Chris Boone had a question of, can we design for problem avoidance instead of problem solving? Could a focus on problem avoidance lead to more transformational outcomes as opposed to problem solving that leads to incremental change? So, as we start this, as we think about the cycle of problems, identification, problem solving, where do we start? Is it focusing on the positive? Is it focusing on avoidance? Where should we think about beginning the journey?
I love both of those questions because clearly both of these individuals are already reframing the framework that I shared. So that's perfect. So when we talk about problem solving, I would say like that is really a shorthand for that much bigger category of orienting towards a challenge, a design opportunity, a place where your work can make a difference. And I think there are techniques in design where you specifically look for places where there is what's called a positive deviance, right? So you look for a place where, although many people may be experiencing a challenge or a problem, there is a small group of individuals in those same conditions who has actually already managed to figure out how to overcome those challenges. And that's a very particular, one specific technique around building from strength, right? And actually figuring out, okay, if we can figure out more about what this group is doing better or differently, maybe that's something that a solution or a direction could be based on. And then, for me, the problem avoidance question is really about root causes, right? And that is a really important point about not only limiting your research or your understanding as you are working to reframe the problem, but thinking about what are the historical factors that have led to the current situation, what are the kind of upstream or root causes of the situation, and perhaps there are the place where you went in thinking that your design intervention might be best suited you might not have been, right on in that as you learn more about it. And I think, that for me is the essence of what I'm trying to express through the sort of journey from not knowing to knowing, right? Is that you cultivate in yourself the perspective that your initial idea is not necessarily exactly where you're going to land. And that's the kind of the permission and the disposition that we're seeking to impart with our students, is that, even the experienced faculty may be framing a problem that deserves to be challenged, right? That deserves to be rethought. And that's the competency that we really want them to build.
Several people have asked questions around the framing of the problem itself. And Dave Guston brings up a really important point in that, the framers of the problem get to choose, right? They're looking at it from a particular value system, and you talked about sort of the historical elements and so on. And so he thinks of, solution, development as a fundamentally political act, right? Defined by the values of those that are choosing. And then ultimately the resources and the expertise that are deployed are also framed then from a particular worldview. How do you, relate to the ethical aspects of choosing problems and then moving through design to solutions?
Yeah, I think this is such a beautifully framed question. So the way that I think about that is, one, you have to recognize that that's power, right? The framing of the problem is a form of power. And certainly if you're in a situation as a designer where you are not personally experiencing the set of challenges that you're working on, you have to be really thoughtful about making sure that the breadth of people who are working on the challenge includes people with lived experience of the situation, and that doesn't just start and stop with a few interviews, but actually is a part of how is the problem being framed or defined? What's the language that we're using? Maybe problem isn't the right way to be thinking about it, to the earlier point. And then the process of building and creating and testing solutions or new directions, again, needs to be hugely collaborative. So I think that's an area in which design has not always been, in its kind of Western form, has not always been particularly strong, right? As a discipline that has sort of been like a professional, somewhat rarefied field. That sense of like, design, is something that a few specialized experts can do. I think that has created, situations where like harm or negative impacts have happened because that power is too concentrated, right? And I think we see as part of our work, not just the spread and the greater access of the ways that designers think and the tools that designers use to many more people, but actively looking at and thinking about the power dynamics that come up in that kind of a design process or design approach to work.
Absolutely. Your talk focused on the ambiguity aspects, and there are a lot of questions around how we should think about ambiguity. Two that I'd like to connect. One is from Tim McCain, who asks if there are specific strategies for helping people reframe ambiguity to be more like an opportunity or a potential. And contrastingly, Stephen Tepper has this question about how ambiguity fits into the reality of the lives of many of our students. They consume higher ed in pieces, and they're take care of their families. And a lot of our students are not exactly only going to school. I mean, they have full-fledged lives and responsibilities outside. They're really busy. They're looking for a straight line to advance and graduate, right? So one, yes, there is ambiguity. How do we frame it as something that's positive and in a place of possibilities? And yet there are these realities where people may already be dealing with as much ambiguity as they can handle. How do we balance those ideas?
Yeah. So let me take the first one, and then if I want to make sure I come back to the second one. So please prompt me. So in terms of specific strategies, I think that there's a little bit of a debate about how much in our pedagogy around like how much should you name that certain parts of design work are going to feel really challenging or disorienting or ambiguous and what that might feel like, because there's a hesitance to sort of say like, you will feel challenged or you will feel bad during this part of the work. But it just is so helpful to at least have raised that possibility with students ahead of time. And I increasingly hear students say like, oh, I'm in that part of the process where we're navigating a lot of ambiguity. And I know that that's something that I'm working on, and start to have new kinds of conversations with their teammates or with the teaching team. So I think, for me, there's something very powerful about naming it. I also think that I get a lot of inspiration from the ideas in mathematics education about productive struggle, right? So like, it's actually better for your learning, your retention, and your ability to apply mathematical concepts in the future to other settings if you don't get the answer right the first time, and or it takes you a little bit longer and you have to struggle a bit to get to master those skills. And I think that the same is really true for design work, right? So having an active and open conversation with students about this isn't easy for a reason, and here's how it will benefit you. That's one of the strategies that I have found to be useful in my own teaching. I think the question about students who are already navigating a ton of ambiguity in their lives outside of school is also a really good one. And I think that I would be that immediately it makes me want to do a deep dive and really understand navigating ambiguity from like those particular students that this person has in mind, from their perspective. I have a hunch that our students in some ways navigate ambiguity quite brilliantly in their lives outside of the classroom, but it's the lives in the intellectual life inside of the classroom or development of skills where we're missing the opportunity to challenge them around ambiguity. And I think that that's a piece of where I want to see how that can fit more centrally into education. And I think that we might have something to learn from students who are navigating ambiguity in all of these different ways, and figure out how we can actually think about that from a pedagogy standpoint in new ways that are fresh. So I love that provocation, and I think we have some work to do to really figure out how to work with students and meet them where they are on this.
Some of the challenges of creating those environments for students also has to do with us, right? And how we frame the learning environment and how we, think of change ourselves. Jimmy Choi has a question on the limiting factors that you've navigated in cultivating change in higher education. What are some limiting factors that you foresee in our own ability to, be the change that we need to be?
Well, I'm not sure that I want to say to the ASU community what I think the limiting factors are, because from where I sit, I haven't seen one that you haven't managed to remove as a barrier yet. I do think there's a question for me about how, about how we actually get new and innovative models in higher education to spread. It seems to me that there is relatively little innovation across the whole field. And, I come from a, fairly, formal and fairly, sort of like normative university from that perspective. There's lots of innovation happening in the research, but relatively less in terms of our education model. And I think that that is true in many places. So we see lots of innovation coming from sort of from startups, from new models that are happening outside of the kind of the legacy schools, with ASU as a really notable, not singular, but a fairly pronounced exception. And so that to me is a real question, is like, how do we actually popularize even the idea that these models need to change? And the nuance that I'll add to that is that we at the D.school about 5 or 6 years ago did a project called Stanford 2025, where we were working with a group of students and faculty to actually try to envision what the future of the Stanford undergraduate experience could look like. And I'm not going to lie, we came up with a lot of ideas that look remarkably similar to things that you all have actually managed to operationalize, which is not to say we thought of them. Clearly you thought of them, and the the extraordinary thing is how much, the ideas around, learning over one's lifetime and different ways of different paces for different learners, and reorganizing, departments around, communities that are tackling really challenging, relevant problems. Anyway, I could go on. Very inspiring what you all have accomplished. But I found during that project that envisioning redesigning higher education, one of the biggest limiting factors that we had is the degree to which we are all very much attached to our own educational histories. So I have not worked on a design topic or a topic with design where I found it harder to get people to dislodge from their own personal experiences, almost to the point where it becomes kind of like an ideology of like what's right, what works in education, being so closely connected to one's own experience. And I think that is a truly limiting factor. That's why we emphasize need finding, which is like, it implies like you're trying to design for others. And in this case, I think we just need to do much more to actually involve students and engage them in the design work that we're doing, to help figure out what this future looks like.
Deborah Helitzer brings up a really interesting question about how, she points out that the system rewards and incentivizes problem solving. And she's speaking about the health system. She's Dean of our College of Health Sciences, Health Solutions. And so if we take this idea of the system incentivizing problem solving, what does that mean for us as we are dealing with really ambiguous problems, right? If there are incentives to get to the solutions really quickly, and we want to get the ambiguity over and done with, how does that orientation towards incentivizing problem solving get in the way of us getting perhaps to the right solution, or even identifying the right problem, or paying attention to the ethics of the situation?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And I have heard this question in various forms before, particularly from folks in medicine or in healthcare, and in law as well. And I think that this is one of the great arguments for doing more interdisciplinary work when you're trying to change things. So, we are products of our own disciplinary biases, in addition to all of the other kinds of biases that we might have. And if you're trained in medicine, if you're trained as a doctor, you are absolutely right in trying to get to the diagnosis as quickly as possible. But I think noticing that as a bias, as a trained behavior in problem solving, is incredibly important and useful. And then figuring out how to build partnerships with people who really have a different way of approaching problem solving or problem exploration is one way to try to tackle that. From law students, for example, we hear a lot about how when they start to work with, students from engineering or from other fields, like they notice a really profound difference based on their disciplinary training. So the law students are really being taught to systematically like root out anything that could be a risk, right? And that's a really hard thing to do when you're trying to have like an open-ended ideation session. It really constrains your thinking. So starting even just the act of noticing that within a particular field, there are some ways in which you're expected to think about, or it's normative to think about and to try to approach problems, and then disrupting that with more collaboration across those differences, I think is one way to address that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that argument about disciplinary diversity as we approach any kind of complex problem. How are you thinking about diversity and inclusion in this moment that we are in right now in this country and in the world, where we're reminded yet again that certain groups of people do not always have voices at the table, or were historically not invited to be there, and if they're there, then they're sort of marginalized. How do you think about the broader aspects of diversity and inclusion as you think about moving us in these directions of appropriate and ethical solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is in the topics we were touching on briefly, in terms of, as you think about the design process, who's at the table when you're framing, when you're scoping, when you're coming up with ideas, when you're actually building the solutions. there's a really inspiring architect from Oakland named Liz Ogbu, who has a beautiful way that she describes her own ethical orientation to working in design and architecture, which is that she always thinks about having two clients in any problem or any project that she's working on. And she thinks about the kind of full scope of her work as being about, making sure that the folks who are going to have to live with the effect of her design, live with the results of her work, are equally important to her as stakeholders and really are a client as much as whoever is paying for the work. And I like that framing. And actually that does not mean that they have an equal say, because in fact, in many cases, the community that will be inheriting or living with the results of her design work has historically had much less of a voice or much less power. So she does a lot of work to make sure that that voice and those perspectives and those needs are actually elevated in the way that she works to build solutions that are going to really work for that community. And I think another really important voice on this, particularly around the ethics issue, is Antoinette Carroll at the Creative Reaction Lab. And she frames design work as being, it's not just what you're intending to do, but it's also all of the unintended consequences. Those are the part that is the kind of invisible part of design work that nonetheless the designer needs to be responsible for. And, particularly as we see design tackling more and more complex social challenges, that perspective needs to be embedded in all design education, frankly, in all education, right? How do we get better and better at understanding what the both intended and unintended consequences of what we're building and what we're making and the systems that we're setting up are really doing and how they're affecting people? And how do we build that sense of responsibility into the kind of premise of what it looks like and means to be a designer?
You talked about it not just landing at the higher education space, but potentially earlier. And there's a question here from Jenny Smolnik about how do we make design thinking accessible in primary education? So you start much earlier than students who come to higher education, because so few actually come into higher education, and then you have to have the right mix of circumstances for them to acquire the skills we're talking about. You're thinking on, getting these skills to learners much earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a wonderful provocation too. I think we think very similarly, right? In fact, it would be wonderful if we in higher ed weren't sort of like undoing some of the lack of creative confidence that our students walk in the door with, that I think has been largely constrained by the kinds of, sort of the orientation in our current school system around, test taking and the ways in which student success is measured today. So fully agree on the premise. We need to have more of these kinds of abilities, navigating ambiguity, design work, creativity in general, like firmly embedded within the K-12 education. I think that that will take leadership from parents and students and, leaders within that community, which, as well as all of us. So I don't think there's an easy answer there, just given the state of our current educational systems. When we see K-12 educators adopting design and bringing it into their classrooms, you just see incredible results. I mean, kids are naturally disposed to many of these ways of learning. And if you think about design fundamentally as that learning journey from not knowing to knowing, that is just innate to how children, young children observe the world, interact with it, test, try experiments, see what happens, provoke things to fall or to, build them up and see what happens. And I think that type of bias towards experimentation and play is it's more about like, how do we preserve that even more than like, how do we introduce that?
So there's a question here about this follows from what you just said about, can tolerance for ambiguity be developed? And one would, assume that if you started early, yes. But are there reliable measures of tolerance for ambiguity? And have you seen in your own students, as they've gone through the d.school experiences, sort of an expansion of their tolerance for ambiguity in any formally, measurable way?
Yeah, I mean, there are some, ambiguity tolerance scales and evaluations in various parts of literature from psychology and education. I think that is an area where I would issue a call for more work to be done by folks in those fields. I actually, and I will say, like, if anyone at ASU is working on this, we would absolutely love to connect. Because I think we need more reliable and rigorous ways to actually study and evaluate this. My strong perspective as a practitioner is this can absolutely be taught and developed. And we need to start developing some of those formal measures. And that's, that's one of those ways that often then formal educational environments will sit up and take note when you can measure something. So I think that is work yet to be done. And I would be, delighted to do some more of that. But, again, I've seen it happen many times, and I would love to be able to document that in increasingly rigorous ways.
Well, that would be helpful for everybody to see, especially as we're looking for outcomes for our students that set them up for success. Ambiguity feels often, as a heavy topic, and Jason Scott here shared how the comedian Emo Phillips called ambiguity the devil's volleyball. It's another interesting and playful way to think about, the ways that ambiguity can work. So that was a contribution, and thank you, Jason, for that. There are a couple of questions about ambiguity and how we as individuals, should relate to or think about this. And Joe Ryan has a question about, he loves, the whole process of engaging in ambiguous problem solving, but then there is always that tension of, converging from, divergent thinking to now narrowing it down to solutions. And so there's always that tension on, how long do you diverge before you converge? And for all of us who've been in that space, we want a formula, and there isn't one. So how do you, Sarah, think about, the actual work itself and the balance between, getting the best ideas and great quantity of ideas and then converging? And how do you sort of know when you're ready to move from one into another?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this is the gift of working in design in a very iterative way, is that you don't have just one shot at that. And I think that, when we teach design in a way that feels really linear, like as if you're just in one moment in time, you're in the ideation process, and then in the next moment in time, in the next phase, you're converging, and then you're stuck with those ideas, right? I actually think that's a kind of disservice to what design really offers, in terms of its potential to liberate us from that sense of, like, we want the formula to get to the right answer, right? So what I would recommend, and actually this, I'll steal this particular idea from one of my colleagues, Carissa Carter, who's the director of teaching and learning at the D.school. So she does something with her students, for example, where she has a final and a final. So she basically has a week before the final, she has another deliverable called the final. And students really prepare for it, and they really, do their best work, and they have their design critique for the final, but then they also know that there's going to be a final. And a week later, many of them have completely reoriented and completely redone what they thought was their best work, because they all of a sudden they get this feedback at a moment that feels substantive, and they finally realize, oh, here's the real potential for what I'm working on. And so I actually think that, like, timing and pacing is one of those things that you can play with to give yourself the constraint to say, like, okay, we're going to converge. We know that this may or may not be the best idea. We're going to converge, we're going to build some prototypes, and we're going to get some feedback. And creating those interim deadlines can force you then to go through another cycle and get you out of that idea of sort of linearity. So I think that the learning the pleasure of getting that critical feedback and then rising to the occasion can be just as exciting and enjoyable as that original part of design that we all love, of the sort of coming up with ideas. And I think that when you have some really good experiences with that piece of it, you start to hunger for that as much as the sort of like open-ended, no constraints feeling of ideation, for example.
Yeah, that's such an interesting idea. The final before the final. because Marissa had a question about how do we help students embrace ambiguity when they work towards a very unambiguous grade, right? And so, the process itself needs rethinking and challenging our assumptions of how we get there. Michael Scott had a question on problem-based learning, and is that really the new shift in higher education that we should be looking at for all of the reasons that you've talked about, right? And your approach to helping students design solutions. So is that the way to really then fully bake in ambiguity-based capabilities into the educational experience?
Well, I'm not sure if the person asking the question is saying problem-based or project-based. I think that the way that I would think about that is, I see tremendous value in the kind of project-based, which I think of as problem-based, so perhaps there's no distinction, ways of learning. And I think it has a couple of real opportunities. I think for one, it is, it allows you as the faculty member to create more conditions, more situations under which your students can kind of safely explore more ambiguous contexts. And that is exactly what they're going to be faced with when they graduate. And so I do think that there is, I think there is a need for much more project-based and problem-based learning than currently exists in many educational institutions. I think the other thing that it does is it often provides students with immense intrinsic motivation and a sense of themselves as people who have agency and can create and build things that can make change. And I actually think having some of those experiences early in your educational career is quite important, and actually then helps students orient towards what's the path, to which they really want to specialize, right? So, it's really a shame when, students kind of, maybe choose a major without ever having worked on a project or having a little bit of a taste of what it would really feel like to work in that field. And that, suggests that whatever their factors are for deciding, it may or may not be actually what they're most passionate about or geared to do. So I kind of like the idea of having, a lot of project-based and problem-based learning upfront early on in your career, and then really diving in depth, and then getting a chance to do more of that project-based work, and with greater and greater levels of sophistication, towards the end of your time in your degree program.
Yeah, and Michael clarified that he didn't mean problem-based learning. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We need a lot more of that built into our educational systems. So Quant Judge had a reaction to our conversation about bringing unrepresented voices to the table, and I'll share with you his thought, and would love to get your reactions. How about using students, particularly those who are underrepresented or low-income students, to prioritize the design choices to see convergence? We talked about how do you decide when to get to convergence. This group of students need a seat at the table as co-designers. Would love to get your reactions to that, Sarah.
Absolutely. I mean, I would be all for that. And obviously in some ways, the student voice is the one that we kind of go to and seek the last in a lot of higher ed institutions in terms of, when we think about what our offering might be. But I actually think it needs to be the first, the middle, and the last. And students in particular who, whose backgrounds might be underrepresented in these kinds of academic institutions, all the more important to have those voices highly represented. I'll give you a great example. The engineering school, Olin, had, as they were launching their new program, they had a group of students who were kind of fellows for a year to really help them design the curriculum, the pathways through the learning experiences, some co-curricular programs. And then those students matriculated with the first class, and had like a kind of accelerated status in that program. And that idea of having the students be part of the founding team of this new engineering college, I think is incredibly powerful. And I think you don't have to wait to have that be, part of an all new program. I think the idea of like really embedding students as co-designers in the ways in which we're designing our educational institutions is incredibly important.
Now, it's interesting you bring that up. We are in the process of designing a new school of engineering here at ASU, and that process will also include students. So it includes faculty, staff, and student voices. And I think that, again, it's a reflection of the importance of an inclusive approach to design, so that it's not the perspectives of a few that shape the outcomes.
Exactly, exactly. And then I think what's really important is to figure out, traditionally, students may have less power than the faculty, right? And so thinking about how do you really set up the situation so that those power differences don't artificially constrain the work that the group can ultimately get to. So I love that approach, and I think that's not a trivial undertaking. And so it's really impressive that you guys are launching this new school with that approach.
Yeah, it's important that you called out the power differential, and finding ways to at least neutralize that somewhat, I think, is important in that process. There are a couple of questions, I think, in reaction to the ambiguity fatigue. We all want to be problem solving, but how, do you have any tips on what you do when you get to the point when you're frustrated? And, when it just seems to be, hard to take that next step. I mean, just from your personal experience of having been in the middle of complex problem solving, what tips do you have for almost self-care for designers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great topic, and almost a brave topic in some ways, right? Because we all want to be seen to be sort of like unendingly productive, right? But I read a just beautiful little phrase the other day on this exact topic, which is like, a field has to be fallow in order to ultimately bloom, right? Like you often will, like see a field where nothing productive appears to be happening, but actually that's the soil regenerating, right? And the importance of that for ourselves is tremendous. I tend to, I mean, besides all the obvious personally, in terms of like days without phone or screen and all of that, which is really important. I personally, as a photographer and a lover of nature, that is a really important way that I recharge. And actually, I almost always have some kind of like unexpected stimulation from some kind of natural ecosystem interaction that like triggers a new way of thinking about whatever challenge is kind of, operating invisibly in the back of my mind. The other thing that I'll say is like, I actually think there's a tremendous value in having kind of design mentors or other kinds of mentors. And that is, again, it's a little bit of a taboo to be able to say like, I am really struggling with such and such at work. I need some help. And finding the people who you regard as peers or as, more experienced problem solvers or designers who you can just have those really honest conversations with. I have found that to be really personally very important.
I loved, Sarah, how you said, the obvious thing about having days without phone and screens. I was like, I wonder how obvious that is to many of us. Some of us struggle.
Well, if it's not obvious, I'll say it. I'll just say it. Like, it's really important, whether you call it a digital Sabbath or you just, block out 2 hours in the morning where you maybe you're even on your computer, but you don't have the internet connected. It's like, it's actually really important that you set boundaries. And I think that we are obligated to model that for our students, many of whom have grown up in without a frame of reference for what moments without connectivity and without being plugged into something digital, for most of their lives. And so I actually, it's both important for me for, creative recharging reasons, but I actually think it's like, we are, setting the tone and the expectations when we're reachable, when we're online, when we're responding to emails, all of those things. And our students see that and notice. And so being able to carve out time for other things and validate that. And, the reality is that without like being able to have reflective time and time for inspiration, you are limiting two very, very important tools for creative work. And whatever that means to you, however you do reflection and however you get inspiration from kind of unexpected sources, whether that's like art museum or being in nature or reading a book, those are really important to preserve as a part of your own personal creative practice.
And that's such a powerful note on which to bring our discussion to an end. Sarah, it's been such a pleasure having you. Thank you for taking us through this journey through ambiguity and all of the insights in your presentation and in the Q&A. You've left us lots of things to think about, both as individuals who are doing design work and as an institution that is trying to design new solutions and identify new ways of thinking about possibilities for higher education. So we're so appreciative of your time and your engagement with us. We wish you the very best as you move on to doing other things at the D.school, and would welcome you back on campus. I know you're going to be physically here on campus. We look forward to hosting you and seeing you in person. But thank you for being here, Sarah, and thank you to everybody for joining, for your questions. I hope we've had a stimulating afternoon, and we're all going to go take the digital Sabbath idea seriously. Take care, everyone.